Hello and welcome to another edition of the FIDE Podcast. Today we'll be taking a break from the coronavirus content to discuss the controversial subject of anti-Western motivated crimes. Do they exist? Why do they happen? And why are we not talking about it? To discuss this, we have with us Ella Hill. Ella is a doctor, a grooming gang survivor and a survivor of honour-based abuse, and journalist Hardeep Singh, who's written extensively about the subject. Welcome to you both. There are lots of elements to this subject, so I think it's probably best for us to jump straight in at the deep end. So if I may, my first question is for you, Ella. Would you be able to give us a little more detail about your own story, particularly as I know that you've spoken publicly about your experience of the motivations and ideology behind what happened?
For inviting me onto your podcast. I'll tell you a little bit about me and why I'm doing this. So I'm a Rotherham grooming gang survivor, and over 20 years ago I was groomed, as they call it, into a group that carried out some pretty horrific acts on me and on other girls in Rotherham. And when this came into the news in 2014, I became aware of it, but it was a much bigger problem than I first realised, and that's what got me interested into re-reporting it, to complaining about the police, and looking into what went wrong really, and what has been the reasons behind why the response has been so terrible. So what I'm doing now is bringing all my experiences and my awareness of the systems and the legal systems that are operating and are failing us so badly. And I'm trying to raise awareness now to bring about some changes in legislation to improve prosecution of perpetrators, the protection of victims and prevention of this sort of crime in the future.
Would you be comfortable telling us a little more about sort of what happened to you? And I know that you've spoken before about the motivations or the ideology of the people who were responsible. Would you be able to give us a little bit more information about that?
I will, yeah. And the reason I do this, I have to say this first up front, is not because I want to promote Islamophobia or stir up racial hatred. It's because I would like a recognition and acknowledgement of the racist and religious elements behind grooming gang crime. And I think that's really important for lots of reasons. So, yeah, I met my perpetrator. I was in my late teens and he was in his early 30s. So there's a big age gap. And this is what is quite common with these types of crimes. It's quite often considerably older men who target younger white girls, particularly, but also girls of other races, particularly unbelievers, as they would call us. Although I'm a Christian myself, I would still be classed as an unbeliever in the eyes of these grooming gangs. And the way that I describe it is that it's a grooming gang ideology, which is based on a religious ideology, which according to them is scriptural, according to them is their faith belief, but according to many other Muslims, that may not be what they would consider to be their faith belief and their scriptures that they would base their morality or their foundations on. And so it's a very specific ideology. And I group it into 5 areas, so purity, modesty, virginity, obedience, and marriage. So all these ideas are what culminate to committing and driving the grooming gang crimes that are happening.
Hardeep, I know that you've written before about the 2012 judgment where the Judge Gerald Clifton, I think his name was, when he was sentencing 9 of the Rochdale attackers, he said that they treated their victims as worthless and beyond all respect, and that he thought that one of the reasons why they did that was because the victims weren't of the same community or religion. And so in ideological terms, as Ella was mentioning about the different categories, there seems to be a kind of almost an anti-kafar, anti-Muslim aspect to this. Could you tell us a bit more about your experience of how this has affected the Sikh and Hindu victims. And particularly, I know that you've done a lot of work on trying to get more recognition for non-Abrahamic faiths in the government's 2016 Hate Crime Action Plan. Would you be able to give us a bit more information about how these things connect together?
Thank you for having me on the podcast, and both of you. I guess before I address those specific points, Emma, I just wanted to kind of, in kind of introduction, provide a bit of a framework around what I'm going to be saying during the next 40 minutes to an hour or so. Is this issue is a very difficult issue to talk about. It's highly emotive. There's a lot of people that kind of swim in this area who are pretty problematic from various ideological backgrounds, you know, hard left, hard right, Islamists. They all kind of have an opinion on this, and they take a very grim view of people who don't agree with their worldview and ideology. And the reality is that, you know, people don't want to get involved in this debate because it's about self-preservation. You know, you've seen what's happened to the likes of Sarah Champion for following her article in The Sun, where she was specific about the heritage of the people targeting predominantly young white girls. You've seen the treatment of Andrew Norfolk, the journalist who broke the Rotherham story, who's been called a racist and an Islamophobe, and you know, has been given a really hard time over the last few years. And I think that all began when they were beginning to be specific about the heritage of the Pakistani, predominantly Pakistani men behind these crimes from about 2011. The Times started using the word Pakistani as opposed to Asian. So I think, you know, it is a minefield. It sometimes, I think for all of us, it feels like, you know, walking in a minefield blindfolded and hopping on one leg. It's not the best, you know, debate. It's not the dinner party discussion that you'd want amongst a group of people one evening, because you know you'll probably end up upsetting someone. But in terms of the history with the Sikh community and the Hindu community, there has been for quite many decades concerns about the targeting of Hindu and Sikh girls, and the belief is it is religiously motivated, targeting non-Muslim girls. And we see this, we've seen this in the last few decades, so much so that there's been Sikh organisations that since about 1997 have been going to gurdwaras and temples up and down the country and warning families and children about the dangers of grooming. So it's a live issue. It's still, you know, these conversations are still happening within the community. And when the white working class girls and others started to being targeted, I don't think there was a real surprise amongst the Hindu and Sikh communities about this phenomena. In terms of action against hate, I'll touch on it very briefly, and I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to talk about it again a bit later. This was the government's Hate Crime Action Plan in 2016. It was a 4-year plan. It was revised halfway through with an update in 2018. But the reality was that the focus when it came to religion was purely predominantly Jews and Muslims. And we kind of, as the charity that I kind of work with, we kind of complained and led a campaign to push back against this, to say, well, look, the government needs to look at all faiths and treat everyone equally. And I think the same thing really applies to victims of grooming gangs, that it's kind of advocacy. They need the advocacy, they need the ability to have their voices heard, and that needs to be translated into policy change. And I can see real parallels between the two.
Ella, you, I know that you've got some graphics that we can show up, I think, on the screen.
Yeah.
I was wondering, could you give us a bit more, I mean, but for both of you actually, but firstly to you, Ella, could you tell us a bit more about how you understand the relationship between the what we're calling, for the sake of this discussion, though we're going to discuss exactly how that plays into all of these various other aspects, of the anti-Western motivated crime, and how that intersects with Islamist extremism and child sexual exploitation?
Yeah, well, I've created this Venn diagram, which I'm using to try to explain how complex this problem is and the reason why it's been so poorly, because there's so many different aspects to it that is very hard to explain. But if I simplify it down into these 3 areas, then you can understand really what we need to be tackling and how we need to be approaching it and to deal with it really effectively. The 3 areas are the racist abuse, which is the anti-Western hate crime, the spiritual abuse, which is the Islamist extremism, and the sexual abuse, which is the child sexual exploitation. The way that the government have started to approach it is, is a very practical way in terms of addressing the immediate problem, which is that children are being sexually abused, children are being raped, children are being trafficked, children are being forced into modern day slavery, children are being horrifically tortured, in some cases killed. In my case, I was beaten, raped, strangled, suffocated. I was taken to houses to be gang raped. When I tried to escape, they tried to carry out an honour killing. I had multiple fractures, lacerations. I had to move away and change my name. So these are really, really horrific crimes that are happening. But they're being tackled at the moment by the child protection services, which deal with child sexual abuse, because that is the primary presenting problem. However, the other 2 aspects, the racist abuse and the spiritual abuse, are being pushed out, or they're being negated, sometimes actively negated, because of various far left ideologies which are pushing against that for different reasons. But these 2 areas really, really must be fully encompassed in any comprehensive government approach. So this is what I'm trying to do, and there's lots of reasons for that. Primarily, one is that in terms of sentencing, the Sexual Offences Act 2003, the sentencing guidelines for that do say that there should be increased sentencing for perpetrators of racially and religiously aggravated sexual crimes. And this is a fact. This is something that's, it's been in the law for a long time, and the fact that we're overlooking this and ignoring it is actually causing crimes to either not be charged in the first place, not even be referred to CPS when they should be, and for them not to be given the longer sentences which they should be given on the basis that they're racially and religiously aggravated. And because the police are not being told to gather the evidence, or they're actively being told to strip the evidence of any reference to race or religion because it might be racist, then the perpetrators are actually getting shorter sentences than they should be getting, which can be even something like 4 years. There are other problems with the legislation where even if someone commits 100 rapes, they're only actually charged for 1 rape. So it sounds a lot less than it actually is when the true facts of the case are actually brought to light. And there's legal reasons behind that why they only charge for 1 rape. But the Venn diagrams is here to sort of show that we need to think about the religious and spiritual abuse. As a victim myself, someone who's been spiritually abused and had been through that horrendous sort of, it's very difficult to explain, but you've been through that horrendous ordeal of someone telling you that they're doing this to you in the name of God, and that they're doing this to you because you're a sinner, because you're not covered down to your wrists, down to your ankles, because your hair isn't covered, because you're not following Allah, because you're not following their religious rules, because you're not, because you talk to someone who's your brother, who's not your brother, your father, or your husband, then you should be gang raped as punishment. So things like, because quoting scriptures of religious scriptures, like if one of your wives disobeys, you beat her. As they're beating you, they're quoting religious scriptures. So your spiritual relationship with God is impacted in a really massive way. It's like, is this from God? Is this not from God? Am I sinning? Am I doing the wrong thing? what do I need to change? How can I do better? How can I do better? And lots of survivors have told me the same thing. Lots of survivors have converted to Islam, or they've started wearing hijab, burqas, to protect themselves from these groups, because they realise the reason they're being targeted is for these spiritual reasons.
How important is, I mean, you mentioned sentence length, but also psychologically, and in terms of the feeling that justice has been done, how important is it to victims that aspect of it, the ideological aspect of it, is recognised by the justice system?
Hugely important, hugely important. For me personally, it's a massive injustice that my accounts have been completely dismissed and discounted. And when I gave my evidence to the National Crime Agency, they specifically, the investigators who came to interview me, it's all recorded on chat, they specifically told me, we can't reference any of this in our report. We're not allowed to reference any of this because it's racist if we do. And you could be any girl that this is happening to, that these rapes happen to, and we can't mention this. And that's completely unfair and completely unjust, when perhaps not with the religiously aggravated crimes, because it's a little less common for that to be prosecuted than it is for the racially aggravated crimes. But where, for example, if a Muslim woman gets her hijab pulled off on a bus, that will immediately be documented as a religious hate crime. As, you know, there's a religious motivation behind it because of her religious identity. Well, the attacks on us are because of our religious identity. It may be that we're a non-Muslim rather than being a Muslim, but it's still our religious identity in the eyes of the attacker. Perception, the perceived identity of who we are in the eyes of that person is that we are evil, that we're Western, that everything about what being Western is evil, that we are slags, we are whores, because we're Western, because we have a Western lifestyle, Western clothing, Western outlook, Western appearance, and that they should attack us for that.
Hardeep, is that something that also rings true with the situation with Hindu and Sikh victims? Because I think I think I read in one of your articles that this is something that had been going on in the other minority communities since the 1980s. Is this something that is also familiar from that perspective as well?
Well, I mean, in the sense that you know, some of the people who have themselves, some of the perpetrators who admitted it themselves, that they will wear a Sikh bangle or a gurra and purport to be from the Sikh faith in order to entrap girls. I mean, that, you know, that's not just me saying it, it's the people themselves. In fact, I've spoken to an individual who has pretty much admitted that's the way he carries on, that's what he does. So there is, you know, that kind of, I guess, that religious element is there. It's kind of, in that sense, it's religious disillusion. It's kind of, you know, using symbolism to entrap and you know, vulnerable young girls who wouldn't kind of question your heritage, and they wouldn't even think that you'd pretend that you're something that you're not. But what I find quite remarkable about what Ella says, and I think the key thing for people like Ella and other victims is recognition and acknowledgement. I think these are the words that she used earlier on. And I find it remarkable that her evidence wasn't cited and it wasn't kind of taken on board for the final report. And the reason why is that the infrastructure and the kind of the current guidelines. So if we go back to the College of Policing Hate Crime Operational Guidance from 2014, that surely should already make provision for people like Ella and others who've suffered these horrific crimes, because it's not really a stretch, is it? I mean, if you look at anti-white or, you know, anti-Western, or however you want to define it, you know, a hate crime is any criminal offence which is perceived by the victim or any other person to be motivated by a hostility or prejudice based on a person's protected characteristics. So be it race, be it religion, I think there's a few other strands: disability, sexual orientation, transgenderism. So actually, you know, this should already be happening, and I find it quite remarkable that it isn't. Now, I think there's another kind of issue that I think people are struggling with at the moment. And, you know, it's a difficult concept to discuss again, but I kind of get the feeling that some of the people that are pushing back against this take the worldview that only that ethnic minorities cannot be racist. Well, we only need to look at one of the most famous Indians in the world, Mahatma Gandhi, and his view of Black Africans, which in many ways was, and has recently, there's been a book that's been written about this, has been perceived to be a racist attitude towards Black Africans. You know, so, you know, we need to kind of have honest conversations about this, that actually racism exists across everyone. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what the color of your skin is. You can have a racist attitude towards any other person. And I think there was a series of articles recently in the Metro, which again kind of pushed this mantra, this kind of, you know, agenda, that worldview narrative that, you know, only ethnic minorities can suffer racism. And I think that's quite a dangerous narrative to be promoting. And I know that Ella's got some very strong views about this as well.
Liz, do you want to come in there?
Well, where do we start, really? It's absolutely massive. The way that I see it now, especially being online and being on Twitter, I have an awful lot of people trying to dox me, people trying to shut me down, people trying to intimidate me, humiliate me, trying to accuse me of being racist, accuse me of being Nazi, accuse me of calling me gammon. They're, I would say, quite extreme, radical, far left activists who are absolutely adamant that I am talking nonsense, that you can't be racist to white people, that I am stirring up racial hatred by saying this, in their opinion, that it's essentially harmful towards the BME community to talk about grooming and crime. And I'm saying it's completely the opposite. We're protecting the BME community, we're protecting people like Hardeep, we're protecting Sikh women, we're protecting Hindu women, we're protecting lots of groups by talking about this. And we're protecting Muslim women, because in protecting Western women, you're allowing Muslim women to have some part of a Western identity. Especially if they're born in the West and they're brought up in the West and they've got Western aspects to their lifestyle, maybe having a mobile phone, maybe having a boyfriend, you know, whatever it is. Maybe they don't want to be covered down to the wrists, maybe they don't want to wear a headscarf. So by protecting people from anti-Western hate, we're protecting all races, all groups, all categories who are currently under attack for being accused of being Westernized. So that's why I use the term anti-Western hate rather than anti-white hate, because anti-white hate can seem, you know, it's a little bit more narrow. But and also with the term anti-Western hate, it does dovetail nicely with the counter-terrorism legislation for the anti-Western hate preaching, which is feeding into grooming and crime. You know, the hatred of the West, the demonization of the West, the propaganda against the West, that the West are horrendous oppressors of the entire world and the entire universe, and that white people are historically oppressors of everybody else. So these narratives being pushed and driven, and then there's very little pushback on that at the moment, although the tide does seem to be turning, thankfully. And that's why I've come into the debate at this point, because I'm trying to voice that we need to be speaking out more against these very hard-line left ideologies that are factually incorrect, historically incorrect. You know, yes, white people have had part in world slavery throughout the centuries, with the transatlantic slave trade, but also white people have been victims of slavery with the Barbary slave trade and the Arab slave trade. So to just look at one part of history and say, you know, just look at a long catalogue of all the awful things that white people have done, you would obviously can come to the conclusion that white people are the evil demonic entity on the face of the planet. But this is a really divisive and harmful thing to do, and it's what the far right do. They will look at all the long list of all the terrible and horrific things that Muslims have done and come to the conclusion that Muslims are the most demonic people on the planet, and that's wrong as well.
It seems that to some extent, because the debate has been so affected by the ideological currents in even modern academic thought or from the far left, that there's this sense that actually, because it's more to do with the abstract, as you were saying, the benefit of referring to it as anti-Western rather than anti-white, that it's more of an abstract, so it's something that is perceived in people who are outside of the group in some way, or in whatever way, whether it's the individual or it's a particular thing like classical architecture, for example, that it's associated with something that is viewed as negative inherently. And so referring to it as anti-Western also has the benefit of protecting people who, this is something that was being mentioned in the Islamophobia debate with Baroness Faulkner, I think it was, referred to people who are viewed as being insufficiently Muslim, people who are attacked because they're not viewed as somehow part of the essentialist view of a particular category of identity. And if you diverge from that in your opinions or your behaviour and your dress or your practices, that it's something that is, it's viewed as part of you in the abstract, which allows people to say things like Trevor Phillips, and someone will return to later, is as being not a real black man because he holds views that are outside of the accepted views for his category of identity that's determined by someone other than him. So I wanted to ask you actually both, Hardeep, you mentioned the College of Policing hate crime operational guidance, and there's also the whole issue of the failure of the government to publish its inquiry into the grooming gangs. What are your views on how the government has failed and what they should actually be doing with these particular cases, but also more broadly?
Yeah, I think the not releasing this report is probably far more damaging than releasing it, and the reason for that is by withholding it, what the government is doing is giving the people who already have come to very firm conclusions about all of this further oxygen, and so some of these people will say, look, we know what's going on, we know exactly why they're withholding this information, and we know exactly what's in this report. And some of them may be very reasonable people, open to this discussion and debate, but some of these people would be of an extreme ideology, be it far right, or various other groups who are operating underground. Now, I think if the government's sort of withholding this, and I do hope they do release it in some shape or form, even if it's a redacted version, which holds sensitive and operationally sensitive information, withholds that. But I think it's going to add fuel to the fire. Personally, I think people want answers. I think this has been a national disgrace and a national, it's an epidemic proportion. I mean, we saw the figures from last year that were published. I think from 2018 to 19, there were almost 19,000 victims of this street-based sex grooming gangs. Now, it was just a thought. The question is, how many of these are racially and religiously motivated hate crimes? And if you look at the annual Home Office figures for race hate crimes, which forms the large bulk of hate crimes in this country, you've got approximately 80,000 a year. Now, the question is, how many of those almost 19,000 victims of grooming gangs, in those cases, how much of an element of race or religion was there? And I think these are really important questions. And I think if the government doesn't start addressing them, we're going to end up in more difficulty. And I think the real key is in all of this is they need to listen to people like Ella. They need to listen to others who have the courage to step forward. I mean, you've got to remember, there's many of these victims will not have the ability to articulate so well as Ella is, and the way she's communicating her experiences. And I think they have to start listening. They have to start listening to the victims.
I think there is a bias at the moment towards BME communities. The debate has been controlled and dominated by the ME communities around hate crime, and it's very unbalanced and unfair. And the law itself is very clear about characteristics, the 5 characteristics that Hardeep said about race, religion, gender identity, sexual orientation, and level of ability. And that we've all got those characteristics, and we should all be protected from all of those things, from being attacked, because we've all got an identity that we're all hated by somebody for. But it's very, very one-sided and biased at the moment towards particular protected groups, which is a different thing to a protected characteristic. So these identified protected groups, which are on the College of Policing, the list here, there's a high focus on the Gypsy, asylum, refugee, migrant communities, anti-Sikh hate, anti-Muslim hate, anti-Jewish hate, LGBT, but it's missing out the anti-Western hate, which is a huge injustice towards people who've experienced it, and it could be an even larger chunk of hate crime than those other groups that were mentioned now. And because it's not being addressed and it's not being documented, it's not being acknowledged, people continuing to be re-traumatized, because you can't heal from a crime, you can't heal from a type of abuse unless it's recognized and acknowledged, and you're allowed to process it and you're allowed to recover from it. And the problem with hate crimes is that they do impact the individual in a worse way, and research has shown that it takes longer to recover from a hate crime than just from a normal crime. And that's because your whole identity, your core of you, has been attacked. And the other problem with hate crimes is that it doesn't just attack you as a person, it attacks your whole identity group. So when Muslims say, you attack one Muslim, you attack all of us, you hear this a lot, you attack one, you're attacking all of us, and we will all act to defend and protect. You get the same response in white communities or in Sikh communities. You attack one, you attack all. It's felt it's the ripples of that attack are felt by everyone. And when there's such horrific crimes that we've gone through, that we've had to endure, it's a huge insult to say, no, you're not a victim of racism. You can't heal, your family can't heal, your community can't heal, no other white person can. It's devastating, and it's coming from government, it's coming from the actual legislation that's been written.
Outside of government policy, and this is something obviously I'm very much against any form of media censorship or online social media censorship, but there's also quite clearly a disparity in how social media companies and their policies approach this issue as well. Because if you look on Twitter at your hashtag white tears, white fragility, white gaze, the use of the term gammon, one famous case that comes to mind is, I don't know if this was a few years ago, but a girl called Baha Mustafa, who was she was a student union welfare officer at Goldsmiths, or diversity officer, and she tweeted the hashtag kill all white men, and she'd also aside from that, she'd been involved in she was responsible for banning men from all white men from a particular event at the university, and the CPS dropped charges against her for that, and I don't think she was actually kicked out of her post. But I think my point is that it's very easy to find these sorts of hashtags. And if another example is in Robin DiAngelo's book about white fragility, she's got a whole chapter called White Tears, and in that there's a story of how she tells the story of how during a group meeting that she described as mixed, there were people of different ethnicities there, the white people were told that if they wanted to cry, if the white women wanted to cry, they would have to leave the room. And then she goes on to justify why it's acceptable to ask the white people not to cry, because there's something sort of inherently wrong about white tears and inherently offensive about that. So yeah, I was wondering what your thoughts are on the kind of social media disparity, and also how these sorts of terms are almost, they seem to be sort of mainstreamed.
Well, the way I see it is that people who do this are trying to counteract anti-Black hate. A lot of this has come out of a lot of things like the Ku Klux Klan in America, where there was a lot of injustice towards Black people. Obviously, slavery is a long history in America. And they're trying to counter anti-Black hate and anti-Black injustices of the police, carrying out crimes on Black people, shooting Black people for no reason other than their colour. So they're trying to counter that anti-Black hate with anti-white hate. And they're trying to counter anti-female sexism with anti-male sexism. But two wrongs don't make a right. That's my comment on that, really. And these whole conversations around white fragility and white tears, they are further traumatizing people who've experienced anti-white and anti-Western abuse and anti-white racism, because they're telling you not only are you not a victim of anti-white racism, but if you cry about being a victim of anti-white racism, then we'll bully you further, and we'll intimidate you further, and we'll demean you and belittle you further. So they're very, very damaging arguments and discussions, and it's all based around this complete lie. I think it's too kind to call it an obfuscation. It's a complete lie that white people can't be victims of racism.
It seems to be also particularly divisive that with this particular story about white tears from Robin DiAngelo, that it's made out that if white people respond by being upset about racism against somebody who is outside of their own group, who's not white, that not only is that offensive, but that it's immoral in a way and unethical, and it strips away the sense of a common humanity, which is obviously something that was originally central to anti-racist movements, that they're trying to kind of essentialize these groups. What do you think, Hardeep, about the kind of social media side of things?
Well, I think the examples that you kind of highlight reek of double standards, and I think it's disgraceful. Some of these hashtags are utterly disgraceful, and I think people of who are from the faith community, no matter what faith it is, but I think this concept of a common humanity. I mean, it's very clear in Sikhism. The edict of the 10th Guru is recognise the whole of humanity as one. And these that. I mean, frankly, those sorts of views go very much against my beliefs as a Sikh. But I think with social media, it's like a primeval swamp. You're going to get various kind of creatures from the Mesozoic in there. And I mean, I've had first-hand experience of this. When I first wrote about pushback against use of the word Asian to describe those in Rochdale and Rotherham who'd been grooming predominantly young white girls, I was accused of being an Uncle Tom bigot. So here's somebody of colour sort of coming out and making a statement. And the other things that were said about me, a public figure said that he's got me on tape giving hate statements, which was total rubbish. I was defamed by a Hollywood film star. I had a lady, I think, from the Muslim community who suggested I was a member of the British National Party, so I'm a vile racist. I mean, it is, it is, in many ways, it's a great place to get your message out. But in many ways, when it comes to these sorts of issues, as Ella has said earlier, that there's people on social media who are basically trying to make your life hell if you go against a certain orthodoxy or a certain narrative which is being propagated. And I think I also want to give credit to brave members of, the Pakistani community here as well, because on this issue, I remember reading a fantastic article in the Times by Azim Ibrahim, and it was with the headline "Honor Culture Protects Pakistani Grooming Gangs." So I think, you know, there's growing numbers of voices within the Pakistani community itself who are grasping the nettle and who are stepping up and actually pushing back against this. And I think, you know, these are the kind of voices that, you know, we need to hear moving forwards. But I personally avoid controversial hashtags. It's just not something I do.
There is obviously a kind of sort of ideological fortress around the whole topic, because the way that we think about this and the categories that we think, there are certain ways that are acceptable to express yourself politically and ways that are not. And so I was wondering what you think about, you know, why is it so risky to discuss this issue, and and I know this is something that you've got a lot of opinions on, Ella, how do the broader far left, particularly the critical race theory and social justice theory, and how might those narratives be justifying violence or protecting perpetrators or obfuscating what's actually going on?
Well, it's massive now, absolutely. It's everywhere, isn't it? It's in every organisation, it's in every equality and diversity policy, virtually. It's affecting loads of parts of society, and it's causing a lot of division, and it's perpetuating not only the Islamist extremists, but it's perpetuating the far right extremists as well, because we're not dealing with the problem. And when it comes to social media and Twitter, we've tried to report lots of anti-white hate tweets. One that was comparing white people to the coronavirus, saying that the only thing worse than the coronavirus is the white virus, and that we need to destroy it and it's infecting humanity. So we reported that one. I haven't quoted it word for word. I'll have to get it up on the screen. You can see it. We reported that one. About a dozen of us reported it to Twitter. It wasn't taken down. And we appealed to them, asked them why they didn't take it down. And they said, well, it's because white people have not been historically marginalised or oppressed. So this directly comes from critical race theory, which is partly Robin DiAngelo, and it's been evolved and developed by lots of academic researchers who are qualified. You know, some of them are doctors, some of them postdoctorate degrees in race theory or in race studies, and they have, like you say, built an academic fortress around these ideas now, and they have whole life careers based on promoting these ideas, which are fundamentally flawed and fundamentally racist and fundamentally unjust. And what they will say is, you know, you have to, as a white person, accept that you are an oppressor, that non-white people are oppressed, and that you are part of this systemic oppressive regime, organisation, that there is systemic oppression which is white, and that this must be opposed, and white leaders should step down and allow black leaders to take their place. So there's a whole massive industry behind it, and a massive theory behind it. They genuinely believe these things, as far as I can understand. They genuinely are 100% convinced that they are right. It's really frightening when you've got people like Twitter, you know, major, massive global companies who are taking on these theories, because they are really perpetuating this problem, and they're upholding grooming gang ideology and upholding grooming gang crime, and they're allowing it, they're perpetuating it, they're making it normal for anti-white hatred to be acceptable. And if anyone objects to it, they'll say that it's because of your white fragility that you're objecting to it.
The hierarchy of the intersectionality almost makes being, if you're at the bottom of that, it's almost some form of, if it were a religion, that would be the original sin, because it's not something that everything is set within the hierarchy, and so there's nothing that you can do unless you are, you know, you can list all of the various ways in which you might be part of another category outside of your race. There's nothing that you can do to kind of expunge your sin, and I think that's something that seems to be very clear through the work of Robin DiAngelo and the idea of white fragility, that it's just something that you have to accept. You can never really be not racist, so long as you are what you are. What do you think, Hardeep? It's almost like a caste system.
Yeah, I mean, I struggle with, you know, some of the concepts that come out of academia, because I don't think they necessarily really reflect reality or what goes on in the real world. And I think with all of this, I think the media has an increasing responsibility around, you know, recognition and acknowledgement of what's actually going on the ground with grooming gangs. And I think the problem I found is people who have a certain ideological tilt towards the kind of academics that you kind of mention. I just remember one high profile journalist on television when she was challenged with the grooming gang epidemic and talked about, and this was brought up in the context of racism and racism against white girls. This individual went on to say, well, this is only going on in 1 or 2 towns and cities. I mean, that's simply not true. And it was in effect kind of minimizing the issue. And I think, you know, whilst we're kind of in this situation where I guess only certain publications are willing to kind of talk about it, we are going to carry on with not having the right voices being heard or the truth coming out. And I think, you know, I go back to that kind of series in the Metro, that series of articles on racism. And, you know, I'm from an ethnic minority, and I found those quite offensive. So I think, you know, there's this other concept out there that, you know, everybody from an ethnic minority will be, you know, in agreement with kind of these kind of mantras and edicts that are being put out. But actually, there's a lot of people that really don't agree. And I think it sort of links up with kind of Brexit as well, that, you know, people took this view that, you know, if you're, you know, white and far right, then you're a Brexiteer, which is absolute nonsense, because actually the reality is that there are a lot of people from ethnic minorities in places like, I think, Hounslow and places like that. A lot of people from ethnic minority communities voted for Brexit. So that, you know, one size does not fit all. And I think people, you know, academics and journalists need to be mindful of that they're not talking for a whole community. They may be giving their opinion, but, you know, there's lots of views out there. And, you know, I find a lot of these, you know, I'm kind of new to these terms because, you know, white fragility, white tears, all these things, they're not something I kind of come across on my timeline, but I find them highly offensive.
Do you think that, so there was a video from, I think it was about 4 years ago now, perhaps, I think it was an Antifa rally, though I'm not sure, I'm not saying I've verified that, but there was a video of a woman. It's almost besides the point, because this woman was screaming at another protester, saying, you're still white, you're still responsible, you're inherently racist, it's in your blood, it's in your DNA, whilst also saying and protesting punch a Nazi. And there seems to be it's almost as if you're saying that that the badness of that person is somehow inherent to them, and that maybe if she's also saying punch a Nazi, does that therefore justify hurting the person because it's inherently in their DNA? So I suppose what I'm asking you both is, particularly with some of these far left protest movements, how does the ideology of it link up with the potential for actual crimes to take place, and whether or not that can act as a motivation for those crimes?
Well, that is a really, really good question, and it's a huge concern of mine. It's because we're not addressing the anti-Western hate crime, because we're not addressing the far left extremism, we are putting victims at an even higher risk. And the government has actually made this a lot worse, and it's been a safeguarding disaster, because the government has essentially said that people who speak out against hate crime will be labelled as a Nazi, being gammon, are putting us at a much higher risk of physical harm from our perpetrators, from the Islamists, from the people who genuinely believe that we are evil because we're Western. And that's for religious reasons rather than political reasons. They believe that we are evil. So we're in very, very, very dangerous situations, and it's not just affecting working classes, it's affecting all classes, it's affecting political classes, because you can see that anyone is vulnerable to this. Anyone can lose their job for being called an Islamophobe, anyone can lose their job for being called a racist. The way that we've started to deal with it is good. I'm not criticising it, I think it's helpful, but it's not enough. We're really not going far enough. Like, we've only dealt with that one circle, now we need to deal with all the other circles. And we definitely need to take on the far left extremists. They may say, oh, we just throw milkshakes in people's faces, we have our hair dyed purple, you know, we're quite harmless. They may look, you know, like an ineffective rabble, not as scary perhaps or militant as the extreme far right, but the extreme far left are destructive in a very different way. I would say that the extreme far right, maybe their specialism is physical violence, the extreme far left is more psychological violence, and then obviously the upper burbs are more spiritual violence. But the extreme far left, the psychological violence that they have on if violence is the right word, but the psychological destruction that they're bringing to people's lives is horrific.
I see you nodding, Hardeep.
Yeah, I mean, it's scary. I mean, I've not personally come across any you know, of that kind of ideological kind of backlash from the hard left, but I mean, I'm certainly aware of it, and you know, there's kind of journalists who have been attacked in America. There's Andy Ngo, who's, you know, famously been attacked for his activism and journalism by these kinds of sinister outfits. The one thing that I am cognizant of is that even within my community, when these sorts of issues that we're talking about around having truthful and honest, responsible conversations about, you know, the motivations behind and the hostility behind grooming gangs, when you're not having those honest conversations, when the establishment is not allowing those conversations to happen and not addressing these issues, what it does, it creates a vacuum, and within that vacuum you get all sorts of weird and wonderful people coming together. And part of that has actually affected my own community. I mean, in 2013 there was a case that's often cited amongst the Sikh community called the Mughal Darbar case, which the Mughal Darbar was a restaurant in Leicester, and it turned out that there was a 16-year-old Sikh girl being groomed on top of that restaurant, and the men that were convicted for that crime had majority Muslim names. Now, before those convictions, a group of Sikhs were telling the police, look, we know that a girl's being sexually exploited, we want you to do something, and the police at that time didn't take any action. So these guys ended up becoming vigilantes, and I think it was a group of 30 or 40 men that stormed the restaurant, and subsequently 7 Sikhs were sentenced to prison for that. So this is very dangerous, because if you know, if these issues aren't addressed, if we don't tackle the motivations, the hostility and the ideology behind these sorts of crimes, then you're opening up to other elements and potential vigilante action. And I think that's always been something that's been quite worrying for me within the Sikh community, that there are people out there who will say, okay, well, the police isn't going to listen to us, we'll take it into our own hands. And I think this is something that the government must really kind of acknowledge and address, and we need to stop this.
Ella, you also alluded to free speech and how this potentially is a way of also shutting down people from being able to express their views about these issues. And again, Hardeep basically saying that the consequences of doing that could be dire. So I was wondering what your views are on how this connects to issues relating to free speech. Like the most recent example that comes to mind is Lawrence Fox on Question Time, where the question from the audience member, they said, I've got the quote here, what worries me about your comment is that you are a white privileged male who has no experience. And also you can find quite easily on Google loads of articles about how being pro-classical architecture has been weaponized by the far right, how pro-free speech arguments are weaponized by the far right. And there's this sense that given that almost anything that they disagree with can be weaponized by the far right, the category of persona non grata gets broader and broader and broader. So what are your opinions on how this relates to all of these other issues to do with censorship?
It's not something that I've given a huge amount of thought to, the whole free speech argument, but I do understand that there are two types of hate crime laws. So there's crime hate crime and non-crime hate crime. So the non-crime hate crime can relate to things like tweets and speeches and verbal comments, as I understand it. Again, if these laws are applied completely fairly across the board, we may find that the people who are asking for them to be scrapped are the people who are using them right now to shut everybody else down. I'm not sure if they would if they would just be scrapped. A lot of people are calling for these hate crime laws to be completely scrapped. I'm not sure if that's going to happen just yet, but if we do start applying them fairly, then we might end up with a very civilized society where everyone is just pleasant and nice to each other, which would be very nice. Or we might end up with people saying, okay, this is too heavy-handed, we don't want this amount of control over our lives and what we can say and what we can't say.
Hardeep, do you think we should scrap them or should apply them fairly?
Well, I think there's a difference between hate speech and speech I hate. I think a lot of the stuff that we're seeing, where people who are vocal and have legitimate concerns about, a whole variety of issues in society, that ends up kind of falling into the latter category, and you end up having complaints. Now, it takes me back to an example where there was a worker in Asda who on his personal Facebook account shared a Billy Connolly video sketch, which was mocking Christianity and Islam. And he was, simply sacked for sharing a Facebook video. I believe his job was reinstated afterwards after sort of a lot of pressure. I remember writing about it as well. But this is the kind of ridiculous territory that we're falling into. Emma, you'll know the kind of exemption around free speech, as probably Ella knows as well, in the kind of protection for free speech under the Public Order Act. So, satire, ridicule, mocking, even, people who try and convert people to other religions, that's all kind of allowed. It's kind of, there are protections in this country for free speech. And I think all of these things already kind of exist in legislation. And I think it's kind of a question of constantly reminding ourselves that they're there and reminding our detractors that they're there. I think that's the important thing. And I'm sure Emma would, either of you would probably be able to quote these verbatim, but I can't at the moment. So sorry.
It strikes me as particularly worrying that the idea that free speech arguments, pro-free speech arguments, or objecting to things on the grounds of free speech seem to be increasingly referred to as being weaponized. The same thing happened with the Islamophobia definition, where objections to it on the grounds of free speech were described as themselves being Islamophobic because they were being weaponized against Muslims. And again, all of this talk of free speech becoming a tool of the far right, I think is something that I personally find extremely worrying. And you mentioned earlier, Hardeep, that about being called Uncle Tom. And this is something quite recently relevant. People like Trevor Phillips, who are alluding to Baroness Faulkner's statements about Islamophobia. These people, instead of being insufficiently Muslim, are almost thought of as being insufficiently black because they dissent from the views that are deemed accepted by their racial category. And Kahinda Andrews, the academic who talks a hell of a lot about this kind of thing, actually described Trevor Phillips as being formerly of the black community, and accused him of coonery as well as being an Uncle Tom. And Trevor Phillips has actually himself been accused of racism, which is interesting because, again, you were saying about how white people can't be victims of racism, but it's interesting that a black man could be accused of racism in this particular context, because he's viewed as being an Uncle Tom. He's almost honorary white, according to their recategorization of him. And I'm interested to know what you think about how this hierarchy that we have been discussing is potentially more complicated than just being about race. It's also about views. It's about dissenting from that particular ideology. Hardeep?
Yeah, I think it is much more complicated, and I think it's shocking that those sorts of views are kind of promoted about someone like Trevor Phillips, who is a man of huge integrity. And I think we're in this remarkable situation now where people that are kind of saying, look, we're victims of racism, are called racist themselves in kind of on social media or in other areas. And I think the problem is these words are becoming increasingly meaningless. So when they're kind of splattered around like confetti, the word racism, Islamophobia, you kind of end up real racism and real kind of anti-Muslim hatred then is subtracted from, in a way, because it's being used every single day, all the time, hashtags everywhere. And I think that does a disservice to the genuine victims of racism and anti-Muslim hatred and whatever other hatreds there are, and anti-Semitism, anti-Sikh hatred, anti-white hatred. And I think, so it may be a short-term gain for these people to try and score political points against those they disagree with, but actually in the long run, I think it actually dilutes their causes, and it actually is problematic.
Ella, how do you understand the complexity of the relationships between the race aspect of this and the more ideological side?
Well, I probably should have said this at the beginning, but when I was being attacked, I was being called a white slag, white whore, white cunt, fucking gory. So, from the ideological side of Islamist extremism, which screaming gang crime is, it's the idea that white people are trash, that white people are the lowest of the low caste, that they're scum, that you're shit under the shoe. I hope we're allowed to swear in this podcast. So I may need to re-answer this question.
We'll bleep you.
I'm only quoting what they said. I'm not, So the ideological racism, oh gosh, it's so complicated, isn't it? I mean, really, it shouldn't be complicated. It's very straightforward. Our rapists are the racists here in this situation. So when we're talking about Muslim rape gangs, I don't like that phrase, but if you want to talk about grooming gangs, they are the racists. So we're not racializing the issue; they have racialized the issue. Our perpetrators racialize the issue when they targeted us, and to call us things like Nazis for doing this, for raising this issue, saying we're under racial attack here. To call us a Nazi, it's a massive insult. And just to go on that small point for a second, because it is celebrating VE Day today, the day that we're recording this. Our grandparents fought the Nazis. They lost their lives. They suffered. They struggled. My grandfather was in Belgium and he went to fight the Nazis. We are not Nazis just for saying that we've been racially abused. But what's happened is now, because this label has been put on so many people are like, yeah, right, I'm a Nazi. Fine, you want to call me Nazi? I'll be a Nazi. So they've taken it on board, and it's almost become a badge of pride for some people and a badge of honour. That's really sad, because that's just cynicism at the far end of cynicism, and that only happens when your experience has been denied, and that abuse is just ongoing. The trauma is ongoing because it's never healed, never allowed to heal.
Hardeep, you mentioned earlier about Brexit. This has affected other political debates as well. Ella mentioning people being called a Nazi for raising particular issues or holding particular political opinions. And if you remember, Jon Snow made that comment about having never seen so many white people in one place, and Novara Media had an article called "The Unbearable Whiteness of Brexit." What do you think about these ideas becoming more mainstream? How it might be affecting political debates, and what the effects of that might be?
Well, I think it sort of marginalises a lot of people. So it will, and it, in some ways, it takes me back to this government hate crime action plan, and kind of the opening gambit, which was sort of by Amber Rudd at the time, and what she said was, hate crime of any kind directed against any community, race or religion, has absolutely no place in our society. Well, that's quite a nice thing to ambition to have, but when you've got sort of statements like the ones that you've kind of mentioned earlier that could potentially be viewed as hateful, and what we essentially need is a level playing field for everybody. It shouldn't be that some groups are kind of given certain privileges and others aren't, or huge government funding. I mean, I'll go back to the example with the hate crime action plan. You had 45 examples of hate crimes against sort of Abrahamic faith, mainly Muslims and Jews, and absolutely none against Sikhs and others. And this was especially damaging to the Sikh community, because a year before this had been published, there was a revenge attack for Lee Rigby, and a Sikh dentist in Wales was almost beheaded. We kind of assume that, okay, the government's going to acknowledge this, especially when ever since 9/11, Sikhs have faced a backlash, and the first person to be killed in retribution for 9/11 was a Sikh. But again, it's this hierarchy. We're going back to, who are the victims that are considered by government as victims, and who they should take some responsibility for and do something for, and who are the ones that fall off the radar. And the question is, why are they falling off the radar? And I've got some kind of insight into this, and I think really what has to happen for people like Ella and others is they need to have some sort of infrastructure in place, or some ability to lobby and get their voices heard. And I'm sure Ella and yourself, Emma, have some good ideas around this. But that kind of, I think what essentially needs to happen is, and I've been thinking about this, what they need to do is, there needs to be some mechanism essentially that allows them a safe space within the parliamentary system to tell their stories and inform policy. And that's the key thing here. And there absolutely should be a level playing field, but I think at the moment we're kind of nowhere near that.
You've swiftly pivoted onto my final question. What you're saying basically sounds as if because of this hierarchy, there are almost predetermined as the perpetrator, and that this is leading to horrible injustices. So just as a final thought before, unfortunately, we have to end the podcast, what do you think is the correct approach to public policy in this area? And how is it possible for us to engage with this issue without making a Faustian pact with the same identity politics that we're also quite critical of?
I think we need to see some real changes and practical changes. So we talked about the hate crime operational guidance by the College of Policing. I think that absolutely needs to be revised and changed. So it's something that can be lobbied for. It's something that absolutely can be pushed for, and voices of victims in order to enact that change. And I think there has to be opportunities for people like Ella and others to provide kind of their evidence to the government again, be it through all party parliamentary groups, be it through the Home Affairs Select Committee or other committees that are set up where they can actually feed in and provide their evidence. And in many ways that was quite an effective way for the Sikh community to kind of at least get their voices heard in the first instance. So I mean, those are my two kind of suggestions off the top of my head. But you've got who are very good communicators, and I think in many ways she's in a position that other victims are not in, where she can actually communicate very effectively what's her experience and the changes that she and others need to see happen.
Ella, any final thoughts?
Well, I think what we can all do from sort of grassroots level, what we can all do is complain. We can complain to all of our local organisations, all of our governments, all of our ministers about these unjust policies. We can ask for anti-white, anti-Western hate crimes to be recognised. We can complain about the media when the things like the Metro series. We can complain to IPSO to say that this is factually incorrect and it's distorting the truth, to say that white people can't be victims of racism. So there are lots of small ways that we can all do this. Yeah, I've been to number 10, and I think we just need to keep on doing it and keep the momentum going, and hopefully people listen.
Do you have any ideas in terms of public policy? What sorts of things could change? Anything to add to what Hardeep had said?
There are so many that are holding things back. I mean, really, in policing and schooling and education, in social services, in councils, in multinational companies, there are so many. I don't know where to begin, but certainly from a position now, what the next steps that the government could take in terms of policy is to get an all-party parliamentary group together from people from all sides, from all aspects, and get everybody's concerns and interests together, and hope, try and work out a way that we can deal with all these three things sensibly. And if we need to get a special document just for grooming gang crime, to define grooming gang crime as racially and religiously aggravated rape, and just to deal with this one thing, I think that could be the next step.
Small steps.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both so much for joining me to discuss this. Unfortunately, we're going to have to end it here, but please, everybody, do comment and subscribe on the YouTube video, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you.
And happy VE Day.
Happy VE Day.